In recent years, a disturbing political trend have arisen. More and more people are sympathetic to communist ideas despite experiences of previous generations. Many leftist YouTubers, activists and content creators started to introduce criticism of capitalism into their works. The very same revolutionary ideas which brought death and destruction to millions of lives seem to never die. Many progressive channels which previously limited themselves to fight for social justice and protection of harassed minorities now claim open support for trying something else to our current economic system. While there were many communists spreading their views through 20th century, their work seemed to be undone by the great failure of USSR, which seemed like final nail to Marx's coffin. It was a promise of a future in which individuals passionate for bringing change for the better could focus on productive goals like fight against climate change, racism or misogyny. However, at the end of second decade of 21st century we can see channels like Thought Slime, Non-Compete, Vosh and Peter-Coffin, which are fully focused on exploring and supporting anarchistic communism in Kropotkin's vision. Many voices are calling against gradual change for the better by peaceful political means, and instead call for violent revolutions, and literally want to fill the streets of New York or Chicago with blood of the rich. Attempts at promoting harmful ideologies by connecting them with productive ones is not a new practice by any means, but modern communists utilize it very well. What is especially worrying is that while right-wing is willing to criticize that new wave of communism, it is usually done with flawed reasoning. As to the right, the main cause of most problems are migrants, minorities or the left and leftist policies in general. Leftist folk is used to such acts of demagoguery, and is rightly unconvinced. However, the threat of communism rising its ugly head once again and bringing destruction and ruin to society is great, and there is a need for left-sided condemnation and analysis of communist ideas. That necessity is main reason for this channel's existence, and hopefully at least some doubts will be stirred in left-wingers committed to Marx and Kropotkin. Hopefully it will help people skeptical about communism to remember that they are not alone, and that there are good reasons for which one should not feel like they should agree with violent ideologies and other to be accepted within tolerant groups of people. This video is supposed to be a general vague introduction into the channel, with basic positions on relevant topics clarified. Communism is ideology which had its heart aimed at creating stateless, classless and moneyless society. Communists famously argue that all existing communist states were not communist at all, due to that definition. However, while it is true that USSR, Cuba, Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam failed at being stateless, and have distinction between ruling party higher-ups and simple folk, all of these political bodies aimed at being possibly close to Marx's ideals. The reasons for which they fail to embody his visions completely are coming from the fact that communism is impossible to realize in real life for any meaningfully stable period of time at any meaningfully big area. While it is true that many communist countries have went astray from Marx's dream more than they needed to function like Stalinist Russia, these are still communist countries, highly concerned with upholding socialist ideals. Communist apologists seem to indirectly, unwillingly imply that in all cases when communist revolutions were held, the participants weren't willing to create Marxist utopia, and instead just wanted to create oppressive totalitarian regimes. Otherwise they would have to accept the fact that they themselves are no different from Lenin or Pol Pot, who just like them were educated people, very knowledgeable in philosophy and fit to lead society in equal if not better measure than our modern communists. Many communists at the end of 19th century foresaw the dangers of collective communism and warned against them. However, those critics proposed more radical forms of communism which were even less realistic. It is also important to remember that modern communists are a diverse group of people. While some would like to cut away from Russian massacres, many openly endorse Lenin and claim support for Marxism-Leninism. Many of them quite correctly state that while Marx and Engels were theoreticians who never got to wield actual real political power, Lenin got to deal with a lot of compromises in manifesting their visions. Collective communism was the only form of communism to be ever enacted on a big scale, and it seems that it is the only viable form to be ever enacted. If you look good enough you can even find Stalin apologists, but they are minor curiosity and are usually on bad terms with the rest. Criticizing any idea or ideology in a sound way is always productive to a discourse over that idea, and therefore is always welcome. However, in most cases throwing counter-arguments against a position is not good enough. Solid opposition should always be required to provide better alternative courses of action. As Churchill allegedly said, democracy is worst form of government except for all the others. These words alone prove my point there. Any choice must be judged not only by its own flaws and merits, but also against flaws and merits of its alternatives. In my opinion, the perfect system which all nations should ultimately try to reach is social capitalism. Social capitalism is a system which consists of two main defining components: free market, that is free foreign trade, exchange of goods, free formation of prices and protection of private property, combined with social care, in the form of universal health care, welfare support, affirmative action, pension system, unemployment insurance and extensive social security. All that surrounded by parliamentary democracy. That is not to say that I oppose regulations. We have historical examples of unrestricted capitalism, like during the Gilded Age, when not only workers were abused, but also the customers had to suffer from terrible goods, so that the only fruit of it all were gigantic social inequalities. Being pro-capitalism is frequently associated with right-wing positions and policies like small government, deregulation, tax cuts, limiting governmental interventions, and trickle-down economics. All these above-mentioned policies do far greater harm than good. What matters though is the core capitalist foundation on which our modern society is built upon. Classically, the left weren't arguing about that core societal foundation. We wanted more welfare and more affirmative action, while the right wanted deregulation, but most of these matters were working on assumed capitalist foundation, with free market and government moderating it. The only exceptions are the ever-growing far left with their communist system on one side and on the other libertarians, in their complete rejection of democratically enacted economical regulations. In most cases, it looks like the best heuristic for being a respectful and reasonable person is to look as far to the left as possible. In the past, when lesbian and gay rights were entering mainstream, the matters of trans people still seemed too freaky to the general public, and yet with time and social progress, trans rights became important, widely accepted matter. Similarly, sex education, not content with abstinence-only methods, gained wider acceptance over time. It seems as if due to the political environment constantly and gradually shifting towards the left, any person holding moderately conservative views without adapting became increasingly more far-right, and any person holding far-left ideas without changing them over time is shifting towards becoming the mainstream centers. There are, however, exceptions to that rule. A perfect example of far-left leftovers are TERF's trans exclusionary feminists who took an alternative ideological path in defining their far-left stances. Instead of embracing transgender individuals, they focused entirely on the problems of misogyny and chose to view all the other matters by the lens of it. Over time, though, their increasing frustration makes them more and more similar to the conservatists like in the UK, where they were willing to ally with right-wing in order to guarantee trans oppression. Communism and anarchistic communism are, in my opinion, akin to TERFs. They are indeed radical far-left movements. However, the fact that they are radical and far-left does not make them instantly right. Just like TERFs produce no change for the better in the society, so is the case for communism. Still, TERFs are far more fresh phenomenon, so we have yet to observe any major TERF resurgence, and hopefully there would be none, but it also might be like with communism. Many progressive feminists jumped into the TERF wagon when the matter of trans rights became more important in public discourse. Even though they have fought for many valuable changes for good, like the still ongoing struggle to end wage gap, they also strayed into unproductive and harmful behaviors like harassing trans folk. People like Ophelia Benson are ultimately the best example that even though people who have fought for a more equal world adopt ideas of Kropotkin, anarchistic communism still isn't a new hope for the future. There are many underlying key concepts of anarchism and more of anarchistic communism. However, the true essence of anarchism could be summarized as abolition of vertical hierarchies, which anarchists prefer to call unjust hierarchies. What are vertical hierarchies then? They are systems of organization characterized by some individuals occupying clearly and definitely higher or better positions than the others. Likewise, there are people under them with worse positions than their superiors. This depiction might seem obsolete after all. Aren't all hierarchies like this? Actually no. For example, sometimes some work teams have distinct specialists doing certain jobs appropriate to their abilities. There are teachers teaching various subjects in school, doctors specialize in a specific type of health issues, and lawyers specialize in specific types of legal procedures. These are sometimes called horizontal hierarchies as opposed to vertical hierarchies. Even anarchists wouldn't deny learned specialists their authority coming from their skill and knowledge. However, even though they like to make such concessions, that does not mean that their vision is achievable. Vertical hierarchies form naturally. I recall one communist who tried to attack the claim that anarchistic society is impossible due to human nature. However, he mischaracterizes the argument as he claimed that being selfish and greedy is not part of human nature, therefore we could live in communist utopia. The problem is that the original argument weren't that human beings are evil, vile, selfish, treacherous and greedy by default. The basis is that it is in human nature to create authority, to submit to authority and to fall in order with it. He ignored that very real part of human nature. Anarchists like to correctly claim that humans are naturally creating social order. Their vision of anarchy is actually a vision of ordered society, society ordered in freedom. However, such misconceptions arise in their minds because they keep forgetting that order and social harmony arise from the authority. It arises from hierarchy, vertical hierarchy to be specific. If any group of people would be left alone like people stranded on an island, they would order themselves into one or other form of society. It is part of our social instinct, part of our deeply ingrained behavioral habits. It truly is part of human nature. Now, that simple society indeed does not necessarily need to have vertical hierarchies. If the group is small enough that every member of it would be at least acquainted, at least familiar with all the others, then vertical hierarchy would not be necessary. Not to mention that in such a small community there would be a minor chance of encountering talented, charismatic, immoral person capable of dominating everybody else. Vertical hierarchies can exist even in very small communities, even ones like small families with just 3 members, or even communities of just 2 with master and a disciple, a teacher and single student, like in some traditional crafts. It might seem on the first glance that since we can have both a traditional family with strong vertical hierarchy and more modern family with both parents occupying equal positions and their children granted autonomy and freedom, it should also apply in the same way for societies. It seems that just as we can have traditional society with class divisions, so we could have a classless society. However, this is the place when scale starts to play a huge role. A handful of washaways could be one of them. They could have charismatic leader, or they could create more egalitarian small society. However, when we deal with situations in which population numbers can be measured in tens or hundreds of thousands individuals, we face a different reality. We have a social environment in which individuals cannot know all the others, can't recognize majority of people they pass by walking on the streets. In such population there are big chances of several charismatic, talented, immoral folks being born who can then subjugate other people to their will, and then fight among each other for dominance. The power of social instincts in human beings is indeed very impressive, for even in all historical examples, when hierarchies fell apart societies did not. They maintained themselves by forming new hierarchies. By abolishing feudal system of dukes and kings, the French Revolution gave power to the bourgeois. The communist revolutions all over the world during 20th century gave power to hierarchical communist parties. Societal collapse is a very rare event requiring great catastrophes. People are adaptable, but the only right answer to lost vertical hierarchy is a new one, even one which upper ranks are filled with folks who promised end of all oppression. However, looking back to where we started this part of the video, we should ask ourselves why. Why does anarchists hate vertical hierarchies at all? What's wrong with them, to ask simply? Their problem is that they are cause for inequality. Even conservative right-wingers agree that class differences cause inequality. They simply like to say that these inequalities are justified, that the poor are poor because they didn't try, that the rich are rich because they deserve wealth. Obviously, that's incorrect as well. Wealth is hereditary, and it requires not just skill, but also a lot of luck to ever even have a chance of moving from lower social class to higher. I agree with anarchistic communism in that class hierarchies of capitalism are indeed unjust, but they are absolutely necessary.